Hi, everyone. This is Richard Hanania with the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Philippe Lemoine. Philippe, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
So Philippe is a PhD student in philosophy at Cornell University. Philippe, can you just tell the audience a little bit about your background? What do you do and what your day job is right now?
Yes, so I'm originally I was a computer scientist. I did a bachelor in computer science, and then I studied political science, and eventually switched to philosophy. And I do philosophy of science and logic. So I work in particular for my dissertation on something called paraconsistent logic, which roughly is a kind of logic that can deal with inconsistent theories. And I also work on something on basically measurement in science and what kind of stuff do we have to posit in the world to understand the fact that we can use numbers to describe, physical entities or, psychological, sociological sort of things. And also, how can we be justified in actually using numbers to represent the world? Those are the two main issues. And as for my work, I'm currently working on creating my own company as a side project. I can't really tell you what it is yet, but hopefully you'll know soon. And I do occasionally I do freelance work in data science and programming.
Yeah, so you're a man of many talents, and of course, since recently, you're a fellow with us at CSPI. And I discovered you through Twitter. I mean, you're also a prolific blogger and a tweeter. So, can you talk a little bit about what your works? You have a eccentric sort of a collection of interests. So, can you just talk a little bit how you decide what to write about and sort of what motivates you?
Yeah, I mean, I actually joked, I don't know, it was like a few weeks ago, I joked on Twitter that what I try, the way I decide what to write about is I try to maximize the product of truthness, how outraged it's going to make people and how,
Right.
and how, the inverse of how many people believes this thing to be true. And so basically I like to write to make the case for views that few people hold, but that are true and that are gonna piss off people. So that's kind of what I do. So I end up writing about a lot of things. I mean, like recently, I've been writing a lot about the pandemic and epidemiology, and I guess we'll probably come to this eventually, I suppose. But we definitely are going to come to this. Because I think there's a lot to be said against a lot of what's been published in the scientific literature. Again, we're going to talk about this. And before that, I've been writing about a wide variety of things from, racial bias in policing in the US and elsewhere, immigration, censorship by tech companies, various philosophical issues. I'm still a philosopher, so I like that sort of things. It's pretty wide range. I'm kind of all over the place. I don't like being boxed in, and like focusing on just this one topic. I do get obsessed with things, and then I have to, you were asking how I choose how to write about, often, I was joking about my process, maximizing like this product I was talking about, but often I feel like I don't really choose, it's just this question that people are talking about and I get obsessed with it. And like at some point something has to come out and I start writing, that's very often that's what happens.
Yeah, I like that you're not a respecter of sort of PC norms, sort of ideological boxes, but you're also not a respecter of disciplined boundaries. And I really, it's really it's annoying to see people talk about, well, this person's not an expert in this or this person's not an expert in that, and often it's the same statistics, it's the same reasoning ability that you use in order to come to conclusions about things. So the public health community was often wrong throughout the COVID crisis, and they were wrong in different directions. So at the beginning, they were wrong in the sense that they thought it was no big deal. I mean, even into like January and February, when it was clear that it was going to come to the United States, they were saying no big deal. They were saying, of course, at the beginning, they were saying masks are not important. And now they've gone, when we're going to obviously talk about this more, they've gone in the opposite direction, not only being too militant on lockdowns, but also on the vaccine. I mean, the vaccines, from all we can tell, basically reduces the risk of serious disease or death to basically zero. And there's little or no reason to think that it doesn't stop spread. And they're still very careful. The CDC now says, just from the other day, that you can, if you've been vaccinated, you can be with other vaccinated people, and you can resume normal activities. And also unvaccinated people, if they're not high risk or something like that. But this was just the other day, and they're still being very, very cautious. And meanwhile, there's very smart people, and this is how that those smart people outside of public health are right, because the public health people always catch up to them. So the George Mason GMU economists, people like Tyler Cohen, a lot of people in Silicon Valley, at the very start, they were saying, "Well, this is serious." They were buying masks. They were saying this is a big deal. And eventually, the public health people caught up. Alex Trebek is another one who blogs at Marginal Revolution, one of the GMU economists. And the same thing with the vaccines. Even they were saying basically the vaccines. The cost benefit of vaccines. I mean, we knew for a while that it was likely going to work and the harm wasn't going to be large. And there were people saying that basically, even if you assume this has more side effects than any vaccine in history, it still would be worth just getting it out there, like pretty much as soon as it developed, or very, very close on the heels of when it was developed. And eventually they were right. Of course, the vaccines were great and they worked perfectly. And there were several of them that all work very well. So yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a broader lesson. I think that we talk about disciplines, and we say a person is an expert in X or they're an expert in Y, and often that just means they're part of this community with the same biases. And it's not like you needed to have a PhD in public health or a medical degree to understand some basics, like masks probably work, like vaccines are probably good. You would judge that just like you would judge any intervention in economics or political science or whatever field you have. So I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, is this your general impression from watching the COVID debate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had very similar impression. My own. I started really freaking out about this thing, and then, I was really annoyed by all the mask thing. The absurd arguments that people would use against mask, and I'm not even saying. I don't even know. I think there's kind of like the same people I would argue against. You would use those absurd arguments to say that people shouldn't wear masks. I know treating mask almost as some kind of like magic, like it's a panacea, which it clearly isn't. We now have enough data that you can see that, it's very, we're going to talk about this, basically impossible to precisely estimate their effects, on spread in the population. I just think we have very good reasons to think that it helps somewhat, and it's very low cost intervention. So it's easy to reach the conclusion that people should wear them. But no, the same people who were using those absurd arguments back in last year, to say that people shouldn't wear them, are basically talking about them as if, they made like this completely huge difference, which they clearly don't. So it's kind of absurd how, and I don't know, it's really interesting how you would think that more people would see this. More people would see people who are, properly credentialized people, like, who are public health experts. They're genuinely experts. Some people will say, they're not really. No, they are. That's the scary thing. They really are. That's what they do. That's what they do professionally all the time. And they're basically, saying almost the opposite of what they were saying, last year. That's kind of crazy. I mean, it's I've found, so I largely agree with what you said, and I've had like kind of the opposite. I used to be strongly in favor of lockdown, and as we'll discuss, I've changed my mind. Because I found that the data no longer, we've learned enough that I no longer think it's irrational. It's the optimal policy. Again, we'll talk about this. I have to say that different kinds of experts have performed very differently, I think, during the pandemic. So I would say, for instance, that virologists
Yeah.
Virologists, I think they've done pretty well. I mean, when I also, one of the things, I wrote about a few months ago, that I did this very long series, Quillette, on China and the role it had at the beginning of the pandemic. And one of the things I did, I went to read back on Twitter what the debates that virologists were having in early January, and they look pretty good, in retrospect. So and I think this has been true. Like, I've seen very little nonsense from virologists, at least as long as they were not talking about public health, and as long as they were not talking outside of their areas of expertise. Not,
Yeah.
again, that, because I agree with you that it's perfectly fine if people talk about stuff outside of their area of expertise, but often, they sometimes they don't.
Yeah. And you're not a big fan of medical doctors, is that right?
Oh yeah, medical doctors. That's another kind of expert. They've been terrible. Well, an example, you mentioned Alex Tabarrok, who's been very insistent, on in favor of spacing the two doses, for the vaccines, those that
Right.
have two doses, 2 shots, that needs 2 shots. And from a cost benefit perspective, I think it has been long very clear that this was a no-brainer. Of course, he was right. He was absolutely right.
Yeah.
But at least in France, I'm not sure in the US, but it's probably the same thing based on what I've seen from medical doctors before. In France, the medical establishment was up in arms against this, because the French health advisory body actually for once made the right decision and advised that the second shots be delayed to deal with the shortage, because on the ground that the first shot was still very protective, and again, from a cost benefit perspective, it was a no-brainer.
Yeah, and in France, we must say that you guys have had a huge shortage of vaccines, much more than
no, it's terrible.
Slow,
In the
so
EU, it's been a total disaster.
Yeah.
That's another thing. And the medical establishment was up in arms about this, and because of them, which is literally thousands of people are going to die because of this. I mean, it's literally the case. I was joking that doctors, medicine kills. It's literally true right now in France. Like it's crazy. So,
Yeah, I wonder something I've wondered. Yeah, something
we're
I'm
going to
wondering
talk
about
about.
with doctors. I mean, I see them all the time on cable news, and I see them on Twitter, and they're often just the most woke people imaginable. And I have a theory that I've developed that people go into medicine disproportionately are after status. Just because doctor is seen as such a high status thing for normal people. Well, professor is also a high status thing, but I think it's sort of different where there's a certain type who goes into it just because they're interested in truth, so they're doing theoretical things. While people who go into medicine really are after that sort of societal status, a very conventional marker of status, and that makes them maybe not very interested in science, and maybe prone to accept whatever groupthink or whatever fashionable ideology comes along. This is just my theory. This is not something I've ever rigorously tested. Does that sound possible to you?
Yeah, it does sound possible. I mean, we have it translates differently in different cultures, I guess. Like in France, I wouldn't say that doctors are very woke, but that's because in France, wokeness is not fashionable, it's not a marker of status yet. So I totally agree, that doctors are they're kind of people are very much after social status. And so in France, wokeness won't give you that, at least not yet. But they're extremely conformist. It's really striking, people at first were criticizing masks, like a handful of the right people, putting right in scare quotes, were arguing against masks, so they were all against masks. And then suddenly masks became great, so they were all in favor of masks. And now, lockdowns are great, and so they basically want people to lock everybody up, for years, and they're all saying the same thing, because that's, so zero COVID is like a fashionable thing, like right now in France, and not just in France. And so they're all pushing zero COVID. And yeah, I agree. They're all on TV, TV sets to, talking about stuff they have absolutely no idea about. Like they don't know basic math. Literally, it's like when you read and don't get me started about the
We could talk about French and French doctors all day, but yeah, let's use that to transition into talking about your paper. So we brought you on as a blogger. Your blog is called War on Science, and we'll talk about the name. Well, let's table that for a minute. But let's get to the first post, which is the case against lockdowns. So in summary, what is the case against lockdowns? Because the conventional case is, well, the conventional case has changed over time. Right. So it started as we're going to flatten the curve. We just heard this over and over again. I remember you were on Twitter and smart people were saying flatten the curve, and that seemed like a reasonable thing at the time. Now it's sort of become just reduce the rate and hold on until until everyone or enough people are vaccinated. Can you talk about sort of what the justifications are for lockdowns, how they've changed over the time, and why they're wrong?
Yeah. So basically, if you go back to early March of last year, I think there was a good case, in favor of lockdowns. And the basic case was this: if you measured the way the virus was spreading at the beginning of the pandemic, it implied that a very high, like a pretty high basic reproduction number, which is basically how many people, if someone gets infected, on average, how many people is this person going to infect? And the higher this thing is, the faster the epidemic is spreading, and the more people are going to end up being infected eventually. So when you looked at the data early on, with such a high basic reproduction number, it looked as though if we didn't find a way to cut transmission very quickly, the overwhelming majority of the population would get infected in a matter of weeks, in a few weeks.
Yeah, so this is the key. This is the key. This is the assumption that they started with. So you
Yes.
have exponential growth, and the curve just takes off, and it just keeps shooting up until everyone, or at least enough for herd immunity, and then it goes down. That was the assumption we were working under in, say, February and March, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was the very important assumption. So it's just like, if you don't do anything, if transmission is not reduced, then you have this exponential growth. And the thing with exponential, is that things are growing at constant rates, so it can get like very high very quickly. And so in a country like the US, for instance, you end up with like, again, in a few weeks, the vast majority of the population has been infected. So even if you don't factor in, the what hospitals overload is going to do to the lethality rate, to the fatality rate, what you get is that, in a country like the US, depending on exactly the assumption you make about the basic reproduction number, and then there are some other complications I'm not going to talk about, but you end up with like easily like between a million people dead. And that's without taking into account hospitals overload. Because obviously, if the infection fatality rate is 1%, so like 1% of the people who get infected eventually die, when they receive proper care, proper treatment in hospitals, it's going to be much higher if hospitals are completely overwhelmed. And like it could easily get, potentially to like 10% or something. We don't know. So we didn't know. And so, of course, then it's a lot more than 2 million. So we're talking about potentially millions of deaths in a matter of weeks. So that was generally scary. And this was not crazy reasoning. Like if this is what would have happened if indeed transmission had not been cut. And so the reasoning at the time was like, well, we need to do something to reduce transmission, so that, because if we do that, it won't grow exponentially at the same rate. And so we'll do what people call flatten the curve. So in the end, probably about the same people. It's not quite true, but roughly the same number of people are going to get infected. But at least all of those infections will be more spread out, which means that we won't get hospitals overload, and so at least the infection fatality rate will stay at, we were thinking 1% at the time, and like there's still uncertainty about this, but it wasn't crazy wrong. I think it's probably a bit lower, but it was a reasonable first estimate. And so I remember at the time the uncertainty was actually more on the fatality rate than on the spread. Most people basically assumed that the assumption we're making about how fast this thing would spread in the absence of government intervention were right. So again, the idea of the lockdown was that, well, we would cut transmission, it would flatten the curve. Eventually, the same number of people would get infected, but those infections would be spread out a lot more in time, which means that we will avoid, we'd avoid hospitals overload, and so we'll keep the infection fatality rate at around 1%. That was a reasonable case.
And they don't say that. I noticed they don't say that anymore either. They don't. I don't hear flatten the curve, right? It's more along the lines of just keep as many people alive possible until we get to the end of this. Is that your impression of the state of the debate now?
Yeah, it is my impression. Actually, you can convince yourself of that very easily by looking at the frequency of searches on Google. Type flatten the curve, and you'll see a big peak during the first wave last time, and then basically today it's basically nothing. Nobody's using that expression anymore, because that's no longer justification.
Yeah. And so what was wrong with the flatten the curve theory? Well, why was lockdowns an overreaction?
So that's and I agreed with that reasoning. I mean, I'm not saying, and I wasn't saying at the time that there was no argument against this, because lockdowns are a pretty radical thing. It's a huge infringement on some basic liberties. That's very important. You should think very carefully about when you want to do this. And actually, in fact, no, I think that it was probably wrong to do this, even with the information we had at the time. So I think I was wrong, but at least there was a decent case in favor of doing that. Now, what's wrong about this is that what we found out after the first wave is that in part because Sweden went against the grain, decided not to do like other countries, and to forgo lockdown entirely. They still had restrictions. They closed high schools. They forbade, they banned public events with like public gathering of more than 50 people. They did this sort of thing, but restaurants stayed open, bars stayed open. There was no curfew, no stay-at-home orders, nothing of the sort. And what we found out is that even in Sweden, despite the absence of lockdown or indeed of any stringent restrictions, cases and death started to fall pretty rapidly, way long before they could plausibly be thought to have reached the herd immunity threshold. Because like if transmission is not reduced in a basic epidemiological model, what happens is that it keeps increasing exponentially, as we were saying, until enough of the population has been infected and you reach something called the herd immunity threshold. And at that point, incidence, the number of infections by day start decreasing. And so what we found out is in Sweden is that was pretty striking that, yeah, sure, maybe you can argue that it happened a bit later and it fell a bit slower, but incidence, fell long before this herd immunity threshold was reached. And they didn't have 50,000 deaths in a few weeks as we expected. There was 5,000 deaths. And so what this showed is that transmission can be reduced without very stringent government interventions, because basically, at least that's my theory. My theory is that people voluntarily change their behavior in response to changes in epidemic conditions, which means that they see that hospitalizations and deaths are increasing, people get scared, and they stop having at least enough of them stop having huge parties with their friends where 20 of them stay together in the same room for hours. And so it slows down transmission dramatically, even if there is no government intervention. And you can argue maybe that there is probably legal restrictions make some difference. I'm not saying they're making no difference.
Yeah, they must. I mean, you reduce people. The question is how much. You reduce people's activity. You reduce people's contact with other human beings, and this is a respiratory disease that spreads between human beings. You think that it's hard to prove, and this is what you do show in the paper. The fact that it's hard to prove shows that the effect can't be that large, because if it was a large effect like we see with vaccines, you would see very clear cases where places had lockdowns look different from the places that don't have lockdowns. And I encourage everyone to look at this paper and look at the graphs there. What you find is it's hard to tell the difference, and so somebody could jump to the conclusion the lockdowns don't work. Sometimes then people do that, but that would be wrong too. you should start with the prior. You should start with the assumption that probably it works to a certain extent. The question, the key question for policy is just how much and what the costs are.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, I don't want to say that it's obvious that they work, because actually I remember early on there was a model that was bad in a number of ways, but there was an interesting observation that everyone has forgotten, that like if you can never totally prevent people from going out of their own homes, and so it's conceivable that as you lock them down, they spend more time at home, and a lot of infections happen at home.
Yeah,
But
that's
perhaps if you don't prevent them enough from going out, you could. It's logically possible that it could actually increase the transmission. I
you're
don't
right.
think that's true. I don't think that's the most plausible outcome. But I just want to say that this is a logical possibility,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you,
And
you should.
I guess the only illogical possibility is the effect is zero,
Yeah,
because a lot of things would have to work out perfectly for the effect to be
yeah. I
zero.
mean, it's also logically possible, but then it's really, really
Yeah, that's
very tiny probability. Say so, but yeah, okay. I say that just because I don't want people to say, it's obvious. That's like people should. Very few things are totally obvious. At least when it comes to like this kind of complicated empirical questions. But I agree. It's likely that they have some effect. So the question is, how large is this effect? And is it large enough to justify the cost of all those restrictions?
yeah.
Um,
And it's worth,
and
it's worth
then,
yeah, before we get to the yeah, we'll get to the cost benefit, but before you do some back of the envelope calculations, before we get there, I mean, I think it's good to dwell on the Sweden case a little bit, and look at look at the U.S. states, because you look at a lot of countries. I mean, you look at you look at the American states, you look at the EU, you look at places across the world, and in your Wall Street Journal piece, Georgia and Sweden figure heavily in your analysis. In the U.S., there is there's a lot of controversy because as we're recording this, Texas and I think Mississippi just lifted all restrictions and their any mask mandates too. And then I think a few days later, Connecticut, which is a blue state, did something similar, although they kept mask mandates, but they got rid of restrictions on business, and I think they left a curfew. Much less of an outcry in the media because I think it's obvious that there's a political bias there. But you look at these cases, and so Sweden, I mean, the Swedish approach looked terrible at first because you could look at the number of deaths and they were high and they were relatively low, particularly in the countries surrounding Sweden. Like it's like, what's your reference group? This is an interesting question. It's something we've talked about before on Twitter, where like, do you compare Sweden to other Scandinavian countries, or do you compare them to the EU? Well, the Scandinavian countries are more similar, but there's only like, three of them besides Sweden. So that doesn't give you much of a sample to work with, and it doesn't tell you much. But the upshot is, if you compare the difference between Sweden and the other ones came early, right? Just talk a little bit about Sweden, because I remember the idea was that there was some timing in the deaths, and people attributed something to lockdowns. They attributed the fall to lockdowns, which was actually more likely towards behavior. Is that right? Is that what you wrote in the paper?
Yes. So basically, in Sweden, the people have this argument. So a lot of people make this argument that you should only compare Sweden to other Nordic countries. Its Nordic neighbors. Interestingly, they don't look at its other neighbors, like Baltic countries, but because they didn't get the result they want. But and on the ground that they provide a better counterfactual, because those countries locked down during the first wave. This is important because I'll come to what happened later. And so it's true that those countries have had very few deaths, even per capita compared to Sweden. And people say, "Oh, that has to be because of policy," because at the time we only had Sweden to go on. Like everybody else had locked down. Even the U.S., almost every state had some kind of stay-at-home order. I think only 7 didn't. And so people said, that has to be because of the lockdown. And they say you shouldn't compare Sweden to other countries. You should only compare Sweden with Nordic neighbors because they provide a better counterfactual, because they have a similar culture or whatever. The problem with that argument, I mean, there are several problems with that argument. The first one is that we don't actually know what factors really affect the epidemic. So we have no idea that for the factors that are actually relevant for the dynamics of the epidemic, Sweden's Nordic neighbors actually are more similar to Sweden than other countries. For all we know, perhaps the UK is actually more similar to Sweden in respect to those factors that affect transmission and the epidemic the most. We have no idea, like that's just a fact, And another thing that we actually know, at least during the first wave, we know for a fact that they don't provide a good counterfactual. Because if you do, so one thing you can do, that's something I did in another paper I wrote. You can look at the timing of death. You can use the data on death, which is much higher quality than data on cases, because at the time, at least, basically no countries were not testing at all because there was not enough tests, etc. And so what you can do, and we have some idea about the distribution of the time between infection and death. So when you know how many people die, you can basically use this distribution to work backward and infer when those people who died were infected. And so when you do this for Nordic countries, what you can show is that by the time Sweden's neighbor locked down, around mid-March, the epidemic was already at a far more advanced stage in Sweden than in its neighbors. So what this means is that even if you assume that lockdowns have a huge effect, which again they definitely don't, and you also assume that you simulate a counterfactual in which Sweden locked down, Sweden still end up with vastly more death per capita than its neighbors, just because at the time its neighbors locked down, there was already so many more people infected in Sweden than its neighbors, that a lot of deaths were already in the pipeline. Basically, it was always going to take longer for cases to go down.
Yeah. So the key is attributing the lower death rate in countries like Norway or Denmark to the fact that those countries locked down while Sweden didn't is a fallacy, because when those countries locked down, Sweden had the high infection rate, which led to the later deaths, right?
Yes. So I'm not saying that lockdowns in Sweden's neighboring countries and other restrictions didn't lower the death rate in those countries relative to Sweden. I'm not saying that. They probably did to some extent. But my point is that when you use death to infer when people were infected in Sweden and other Nordic countries, what you find is that there was already so many more people infected in Sweden by the time its neighbors locked down, that even if it had locked down and you make some crazy assumption about how effective the lockdown would have been, what you find is that there would still have been far more people who would have died in Sweden than in other Nordic countries. So you can't make the assumption that most of the difference come from the difference in policy, because when you look, even if you assume that you run a counterfactual simulation where Sweden actually locked down, it had a huge effect, a much larger effect than it actually has, you still end up with far more death, per capita in Sweden than other neighboring countries.
Yeah, and so when you look at, in the end, the upshot of all this is, if you look at deaths per capita in Sweden, and then you compare it to the rest of the EU, there's no difference, and that's the first chart in your paper, and it's and then Georgia is a case where it's similar, where the media lost their minds because they were saying, there's an Atlantic article, they were saying this is an experiment in human sacrifice, and guess what? Georgia and the rest of the United States is about the same, right, per capita. And I was just looking at the American deaths per capita by state, and there's not really any patterns you can discern. Like, you'd think like, oh, the red states would be one way, the blue states would be other way. The worst states are New York and New Jersey. And then I think Massachusetts. So actually, like the Democratic, more liberal states, but who knows? Like, I don't think it's policy. I don't think it's necessarily policy. It's probably just bad luck and their international travel and cold weather. And there's other things too. And then you get like, South Dakota is like number 6 or 8 or something, and the media keeps talking about South Dakota as like the biggest failure, when like Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey are just are the worst ones. And it's it's amazing. You can find so many facts, so-called, actual facts that support the narrative that you want to tell, right? And it's all just selective. You have to sort of step back and ask a big question. Okay, is is there a big difference between, say, conservative liberal states in America? Is there a big difference between Sweden and other countries in EU? And we just don't see it. I mean, we just don't see it. And you contrast what we see with vaccines. So vaccines is something that has a huge effect. And can you talk about like why you can make easy inferences based on the effect of vaccines versus why you can't for lockdowns?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, you're right about lockdown. It's pretty, and other stringent restriction. It's pretty striking, and like there's when you look at the data without cherry picking, and you just look at basic like descriptive statistics. You just look at charts, that show how the number of cases, death have been changing, and look at the timing of the different restrictions. Again, I'm not saying that restrictions have no effect, but if they had a huge effect, it would be much easier to see. Like to see them on those charts, you really have to squint, or often you just can't. It's just impossible, and you have to bring in like very sophisticated statistics to actually find an effect. But then I don't know if you want me to talk about this right now, but like the problem with general like sophisticated statistical techniques is that they require that you make pretty strong assumptions, and those assumptions they're not something that you find in the data. Those are assumptions that you make, so that you have to make them to use those statistical techniques, and
Yeah.
usually you don't have very strong reasons to assume that those things are true, and so I think that if your sophisticated statistical analysis finds a huge effect relying on those very strong assumptions, but when you look at simple statistics, descriptive statistics, a bunch of simple charts, and you can't actually see the effect, which is supposed to be huge according to your fancy statistical analysis, then I think you have far more reason to trust what you can see just using at a bunch of charts than to believe that those very strong assumptions that, again, you didn't find in the data. Those are assumptions that you made because you need to make them, and they may have sounded reasonable to you, whatever. Sometimes, very often, they are not reasonable at all, actually. But you need to make them to use your fancy statistical methods because they rely on them. If you can't see this huge effect in simple statistics, you have more reason to trust what you can see in like a bunch of charts than in those strong assumptions, which again don't come from the data. So a lot of people, constantly cite studies that allegedly, supposedly found, showed that people say that, they showed that lockdown like had a huge effect. I mean, maybe we'll talk about the final study later. But there are many of them that say, they save millions of lives and blah, blah, blah. They're supposed to have this huge effect on transmission. When you look at a bunch of simple charts, you can't see that. It's just not plausible that if the effect were so large, you should be able to see it on like a bunch of very simple charts. You compare that with vaccination. That it's really striking. The vaccination, we also expect it to have a huge effect. And actually, in the case of vaccination, in countries and places that have already started, if you look at age classes where a lot of people have already been vaccinated, you don't need any fancy statistics to see the effect. I mean, you just plot the number of hospitalization by different age groups in Israel, for instance, and you're going to see it. It's going to be clear as day. And you won't need any like very sophisticated statistical analysis to see it. And that's what a very large effect looks like. Then you can do I'm not saying that fancy statistical analysis and like techniques are useless. They're important. That you need to use them. You will need to use them to estimate this effect more precisely. But the point is that if you expect a very large effect, you should be able to see it more easily without doing all these fancy statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same place as you. I mean, I have, I have a degree in political science, and we learn these statistical methods and we learn the limitations of them. But then when we go out there in the real world, we ignore those limitations, and we just go out there, and you just end up plugging a bunch of numbers, in a spreadsheet or in a data frame, and then you just run a few lines of code, and you've got a regression, and you think that it tells you something about the world, and there are so many assumptions that go into that. Like you're not forgetting about any other variable, right? That's the omitted variable bias is probably the most important one, or there's not reverse causality, or there's all these different problems. And I think you're right in that it's like what academics do is they do these fancy statistics, as you call them, and then they extract an effect, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's like it's something that's small, and you really need to squint, and you really need to work hard in order to find it. And if that's the case, first of all, it's probably not that reliable. I mean, all the assumptions probably don't hold, but even if it is true, you found something very, very small about the world. And what's important is the big stuff by definition. Is what are the major effects on phenomena that we care about, like economic growth or crime or whatever. In the case of lockdowns, when you're just looking at the cost benefit, you're collapsing the economy, you're restricting people's freedom in an extreme way, and for that you're going to need something better than just a little, a p-value of 0.05 or whatever, some kind of small effect in order to justify that. The burden of proof has to be high, depending on the restriction on freedom you're calling for. For masks, we can we can be a little more we can be a little more tolerant of uncertain data, because the costs are small. They cost what, like a buck or two, right? And then N95 is, I think, a little more expensive. But basically, you're not just shutting people down and keeping them at home and taking kids out of school for months and months, for a year plus. So there's no, people just. I think this is a problem with political discourse more generally. And I study foreign policy, and especially in the years after 9/11, and like the first decade, then basically there was no discussion of cost benefit. It was like, okay, there was a terrorist attack, there could be more terrorism, and whatever we have to do to stop terrorism, it's worth doing, right? And if you stop one terrorist attack, and you start a war, and you you lose $1 trillion, that's considered okay, because nobody could say, well, maybe we just not worry about the problem, because the cost, what you're proposing we do about it is just worse than the problem itself. So yeah, I mean, the lack of cost benefit here is just frustrating. I mean, every part of it is just crazy. I mean, there seems to be this binary thinking. There's this thinking of, okay, something works, so let's do it. Something doesn't work, let's not do it. And there's just no subtlety there. And I think that's why economists have done relatively well, because they're just trained to think in terms of cost benefit. And that is, I mean, it seems like a small thing, but it's huge for thinking about policy, because everything has to be cost benefit in the end. You can't have these sacred values. We can't lose a single life, right? I mean, do you see it the same way?
Yes. I mean, economists, it's kind of a cliche to say that there are only trade-offs, is what they say, and the rest. So I think you're right that they're basically trying to think in those terms. So I agree, that they've been much better about this sort of things. Like, and most of the people who have, let's say, received, liked, the stuff that I've written on lockdowns, like my latest report for CSPI. A lot of them have been economists, at least among academics. Like, there are lots of economics who would like that, because they're trying to think in those terms. And I agree with you. I mean, it's we're talking about huge infringements on people's basic liberties that have a huge cost on, like, everybody's focusing on the economic cost, but before, what I do in the report is I don't even take into account economic costs. Let's assume they have no long-term economic costs, or even short-term, for that matter. They still have an immediate effect on people's well-being. I mean, I'm talking from France, and here there's been, for 2 months, there's been a curfew at 6 p.m. Like, we're treated like criminals if we go out after 6 p.m. That's I mean, it's not a normal thing. Before you do this, you need some, like you said, the evidentiary bar should be very high, before you do this to your population. We've been doing this for 2 months. we have absolutely no idea whether it does anything. I mean, by the only, even like the epidemiologists who advise the French government to acknowledge that, at least they acknowledge on a few occasions that there is no clear way to detect an effect, So they just, but the governments are playing it by ear, like there's so much pressure, especially from the media, from the medical establishment, to do something. So they do something, no matter what it is, no matter how stupid or they end up doing things that wouldn't pass a cost benefit test in a million years. And but they have to do something because people are talking about oh my god, the hospitals are going to get overwhelmed, and again, when you look at the data, whatever the effects that stringent restrictions have on transmission, it's not so huge that it's going to make a huge difference on hospitals being overwhelmed. Sometimes they get overwhelmed, this happens, and this is bad. I'm not saying it's not bad, but it's also bad to lock up the entire population at 6 p.m. every day for 3 months, which is what's going to happen because they said it's going to last another 4 to 6 weeks. And usually when they say it's 4 weeks, it's double that. So who knows what they're going to do? I don't think they'll be able to do this. People are going to start to get really fed up. But you end up doing something like this, which for all we know would have made almost no difference. I mean, it's
And I'm looking at the back of your envelope calculation. So you say in Sweden, if you assume that a lockdown will save 5,000 lives, which is which is the total that died in the first wave. So that's ridiculous that a lockdown would save 5,000 lives now because more people are getting vaccinated and people are not naive when facing the virus. You're saying that you would have to reduce people's well-being by at most 1% over the next 4 months in order to cost benefit test, right? And are you even taking into account? I can't remember years of life lost. Are you taking into account that the people who die from COVID tend to be older, or was that factored in or not?
Yeah, it is factored in, but actually I made a very conservative assumption on this. So what I did is I used this study that estimated the average years of life lost for people who died of COVID-19 in Sweden. But it's similar in other places. I mean, it varies depending on the country, but it's very similar. So in Sweden, I think the study found it was 9.8 years on average of years of life. So basically, but when you look at how they found this, estimated this number, what they did is that they took the conditional, the life expectancy conditional on age and sex of the COVID-19 victims. And they assumed that all of the people who died of COVID-19 in Sweden would have gone on to live as long as people of the same age and sex do on average. Of course, that's false. Of course, that's false. The fact that they died of COVID-19 is a sign that they were in poorer health than the average of the same sex and age.
Sure, right.
So this estimate of 9.8 years average years of life lost, that's at best, that's an upper bound on the actual number. But never mind. What I did is I assumed it was 10 years. So, I'm making very conservative assumptions. I assume it was 10 years. And then, like you said, I say, okay, let's assume that a lockdown, if they did a lockdown now, because, no, it seems to be going down again, or at least I've reached a plateau. But when we published the report, it was increasing in Sweden again. And so people were calling for a lockdown. Say, okay, no, it's time to do it. It's going to be a disaster. Even if you assume, so I assume, that it will save 5,000 people, which, as you say, is ridiculous. I mean, 5,000 people is about the same number of people who died during the first wave, when most people got infected at the time when the population was behaviorally naive. What it means is that people didn't even know there was a dangerous virus around. They didn't change their behavior at all. Nobody was getting vaccinated, whereas right now, like, I think half of the population in nursing homes in Sweden have received the first shot of the vaccine, and it's only going to increase. So it's ridiculous to think that a lockdown would save 5,000. You would have to assume it would save about the same number of people as the total number of people who died during the first wave, when all those things were different. Like the people are behaviorally naive, like nobody was getting vaccinated, etc. That's ridiculous. But even if you make this ridiculous assumption, and you ignore the other consequences of lockdown, in particular the economic effect. So you assume that the only cost of lockdown is the immediate effect they have on people's well-being. Like just again, the fact that you're locked up in your home, inside your home after 6 p.m. in France, for instance. If in a lockdown it's all the time, except when you're authorized to leave. It reduces people's well-being. It reduces people's well-being. They can't. The fact that they can't go to a restaurant, can't go to a bar, can't meet with their friends, etc. All those things, they reduce people's well-being compared to what the Swedes can do right now with far less restriction than we have in France. So if you make this ridiculous assumption that I've made, that that on average, people who die of COVID-19 would have gone on to live another 10 years, and that a lockdown would actually save 5,000 people, even if when you make those ridiculous assumptions, in order for the lockdown to pass a cost-benefit test, you'd have to assume that all of those restrictions would reduce people's well-being for at most 1.1%, I think.
So
which means that
in concrete terms, yeah, that means that if there's the next 100 days, so it's about 120 days for 4 months, they wouldn't give up one day out of approximately one.
Basically, you have to assume that they wouldn't be willing to sacrifice more than 32 hours of the next 4 months to be able to enjoy the semi-normal life that they currently do, and not be locked up all the time, like not being able to send their kids to school, not being able to go to restaurants, etc., etc., etc. I mean, who believes that?
Yeah, and some people, of course, won't go back to a normal life. You mentioned this too, because they would be scared. This is what we talk about. This is what you talk about in the paper. That it's this inverted U shape where things get bad. People change their behavior. I think an important point is that human beings vary a lot. So some people, like me, for example, I'm not a very sociable, outgoing person. Like if I can't go to parties for a while, I can live with that. I sort of like working at home and just being with my family, and that's okay with me. And me, I probably would just, be careful of COVID because I don't, I don't like to go much out anyway. So it's sort of almost an excuse not to go out. While other people, but I understand there's variation in human, in human preferences and what causes well-being. And if I was at a different point in my life, when I was out there looking for a girlfriend or a potential spouse, it would have been huge for me to stay home for a year. It would have been absolutely nightmarish. Especially when you're young, when you're a teenager. I think this is, true for me. I think it's true for a lot of people. Like every year, like I picked up so much in terms of social skills that I was better at it than the year before. And I felt this going from my teens to my 20s to my 30s. And you're just taking away all of that. Like I'm a little bit older now, I'm mid 30s. So my development is sort of, I'm still not developing in the same way I was when I was younger. But you're just taking away those options from people. You're like taking away the variation. If you're desperate, if you need to go to work and you need to send your kid to school, right? You're taking that away. Some people, it's okay. They can do homeschooling or whatever. Some people can't, right? And this is the problem with the lockdowns. It's just a top-down, one size fits all for everybody, and for little consequence in terms of lives saved.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there are so many examples. You mentioned. Imagine you're a 38 years old woman who is not yet married but wants to have kids.
Yeah, you lost
1 year at that age. That's a huge difference. I mean, that's a huge difference. Like it could change your life for the worse, like for most people, a lot of people really want kids, and like if they can't have them, it has a huge effect on their well-being for the rest of their life,
and even if you're not a 38-year-old woman, even if you're like a man in your 20s, sometimes it's just sort of random if you meet the right person. And let's say, you're in your years between 18 and 38. A year stay home, let's say it's an even distribution of when you're likely to meet someone who's going to end up being your spouse. Well, you lost 5% chance. Your chance of getting married is 5% lower. Now, that's probably stupid because you'll probably make up for it by going out more later. And so you'll be out desperate. So it's not exactly right. But yeah, I think we're right that the costs are, absolutely huge, and just, nobody cares. I mean, this is just a failure of, it's like listening to the, it's, as I say, it's a failure of just being able to think logically, just being able to think in cost benefit terms. It's a triumph of the science. If the sense is the science is you listen to one group of people that only factors one thing into account, and you just listen to them. But in terms of making trade-offs, I think we've done just an absolutely terrible job.
Yes, yes, it's very similar. It's very similar to the debate about the delaying the second shot of the vaccine when you're facing a shortage. It's very similar kind of cost benefit reasoning that nobody is making except a few outsiders, at least outsiders from government and the public health profession, basically, and the medical profession, because at least in France, the doctors are all in for lockdowns. Like if we listen to them, they keep us locked down forever. It's really crazy.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's sort of like I remember again. I keep going back to the war on terror just because it's such to be an emblematic case of the failure to do cost benefit analysis. If you listen to some of these people who are so-called terrorism experts, who thankfully don't have as much prestige as doctors, you would basically spend 8 hours in the airport. You would never get on your flight. I mean, these people would shut down our lives, and that's yeah. We have to push back against that form of so-called expertise. But anyways, I want to shift to one something that's slightly different, which is well, it's the same topic.
Can I just add one thing on this?
Sure, go ahead.
I think there's an interesting thing here. A friend of mine made this comment on Twitter a few weeks ago. We used to look, to read the books about, say, Maoist China, and we see those people do absurd things. They make absurd things for ideological reasons, and we used to think, this makes no sense. This could never happen here because, and I'm not saying, lockdown is comparable to the horrors of Maoism. What I mean is the comparison I'm making is the absurdity. We're like in France, we're doing these absurd things like the curfew at 6 p.m., which everybody admits that whatever effect it has, it's so small that we can't even detect it reliably. But we're still doing it for 3 months, locking up the entire population, like 67 million people for 3 months. Even though by their own admission, they don't even know if it does anything. And it's interesting. Now we have a glimpse of how really absurd things can be done, in government, when just because there's some kind of there are lots of collective action problems and wrong, messed up incentives. And you end up with this kind of thing where you have entire governments, entire bureaucracy, administrations, doing all working together to do this completely absurd thing, and it just happens. And I found that interesting because I did used to think, several times I've read about Maoist China or Stalinist Russia, Soviet Union, and thinking, how could this ever happen? It just seems so weird. And now I see that this sort of absurdity can happen, irrational behavior on a very large scale. I realize how easily it can happen.
I have some thoughts on that. I mean, I think certain aspects of our elite culture are just as crazy as Maoist China or Stalinist Russia. We are lucky because they do not have the physical courage and true conviction of their beliefs that the people in Maoist China and the Bolsheviks had. And also, they tended to be, I think there's something about the feminization of the left, which makes it less inherently violent. But we can get to that. So we can get to that some other time. I don't worry about feminist genocide or anything like that. I think that's had an effect on the left in general. But topic for another day. I just wanted to talk quickly about East Asia, because you don't. Somebody on Twitter mentioned you don't talk about East Asia, but I think it helps your case. And what I find fascinating about East Asia and how they've dealt with COVID is you've had an experiment where you've had a variety of approaches. So you had China, where it started, which was just a totalitarian lockdown, and they killed the virus. They just destroyed it. I mean, it's not there anymore. It's barely there anymore. You have Taiwan and South Korea, which are democracies and aren't as totalitarian, but have really good contact tracing. And they seem to have more reasonable governments than we do. Like, for example, they didn't get masks wrong. Apparently, they were recommending masks from the beginning. But then you have Japan, which did basically nothing, which sort of behaved like a Western government. And each of these countries basically had very, very low COVID deaths compared to the West. How do you think about that, and what do you think can explain that?
Yes, it's very mysterious. I don't claim to have an explanation. I mean, I have some hypotheses, but none of them is fully satisfying. People say, it's not true that I don't talk about this in the report. I do actually talk about this a little. It's certainly not a focus because I'm focusing on what's going on in the West and Europe and the US particularly. But I do talk about, so one thing I talk about is like the contact tracing explanation. So people assume that, first of all, it's not, countries like South Korea or Taiwan are not really good cases, to support lockdown because, well, they didn't lock down. So I mean, that's kind of a very basic argument here, is that it's kind of weird to use countries that never locked down to say that you should absolutely lock down. That's just, I don't know. Maybe I don't understand basic logic, but it doesn't strike me as a very good argument. But people explain this. They say, the reason why South Korea and Taiwan say were able to basically eliminate the virus is because of their amazing contact tracing. And look, I'm not saying that this. I'm not even saying this is false. All I'm saying is that people have no evidence whatsoever that this is true. All they know is that those countries didn't lock down. They were able to more or less eliminate the virus, and they also do contact tracing. But it doesn't mean that contact tracing is what does the explanation here. And I'm very skeptical that it actually does, because there are other countries in East Asia that have managed to basically suppress circulation of the virus. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia. And look, I'm willing to believe that a country like South Korea, which has an excellent health infrastructure, which is very rich, it's per capita GDP is comparable to like Western European countries and the US. I mean, the US is higher, but so I'm willing to believe that a country like that can do something really good with contact tracing. Again, I'm very skeptical that this is, even in South Korea, that this is what does most of the work, but at least it's something I can believe, even though we don't have any clear evidence that this is what happened. But then you go to countries like Myanmar, or Cambodia, or Thailand that are like 1/6 or like 1/10 or even more than that of the GDP per capita of a country like Germany, which I know has invested a lot in contact tracing, but still wasn't able to prevent the virus to go wild. And I'm like, really? Am I supposed to believe that those countries have such amazing, they don't even have enough money to do mass testing, but I'm supposed to believe that they were able to basically suppress the virus thanks to their awesome contact tracing? I mean, I don't buy it, and I don't think anyone rational should buy it. So I don't know exactly what happened. One hypothesis I have, but it's kind of an hypothesis.
One thing you could say is that it helps your case because policy seems not to matter. You have these wildly different policies, and you have these wildly different results. I'll just looking at the numbers. So per million people, South Korea had 32 deaths per million. Japan has had 66. So Japan is twice as bad as Korea, but it's still very low. And if you look at China, it's 3. Now, China, I think, is impressive because it started there. So they should have been hit the hardest, and they had absolutely no warning. And people say you can't believe the data. Well, I mean, I think that's wrong. I think you can for the most part, believe them. And then you have Taiwan, which is 0.4, and you have Vietnam, which is 0.36. So all these countries, I mean, you look at the map and they're the same color. They're all white and are rolled in data, and Europe and America are all red or black. Red because white is lower. But there's massive differences in that. But the point is they all did really well. And maybe because Japan didn't have as good contact tracing as Korea, maybe it had twice as many deaths. But Japan still had a lot fewer deaths than I think just about anywhere in the West. And that tells you something interesting. The policy doesn't seem to matter that much. At least it doesn't matter as much as whatever's making the West different from the Far East.
Yeah. I mean, even Japan, we say, I think we shouldn't insist on the fact that it's twice as much as South Korea, because really the absolute increase is totally negligible. I mean, it's twice as much of something very small. So, it just doesn't really matter. But for sure, it was a bit more. And yeah, I totally agree that there is this, like, I mean, when you look, I've read some stuff about what Thailand has been doing. There's absolutely no question that we did vastly more. Governments did vastly more, use vastly more costly methods to fight the virus than they did, and they still, like, their outcomes are so much worse. It's just so the idea is policy, but I have to say, that also it's also interesting in Europe. I was talking about how during the first wave, um, the Nordic neighbors of Sweden did much better, but that this is what you would have expected. Even if Sweden had locked down, at a huge, it was already much more, like, the epidemic was already at a far more advanced stage in Sweden than its neighbors. So you would have had a lot of more death anyway. But what's interesting about Nordic countries is that some of them are actually kind of like East Asian countries in terms of outcomes. It's not as extreme, but it's still extremely low. In Finland is actually not much higher than Japan, I think.
Yeah, let me look at. Let me actually pull this. Let me just go over this because I have this map in front of me. So 66 Japan, 30 Korea. Then you go to Finland, it's 140, right? So you go another twice as much as Japan. You go to Norway, 116.
Yeah.
But I mean these aren't big when you look at the difference. So Poland, right? Just to take another country at random, 1,204 per million, right? France, 1,370. So 100 between Japan and Norway is not a big deal because these are 10, 11, 12 times as much in these countries.
Yeah, and here's the thing, what's interesting is that Finland, sure, they locked down. Everybody is focusing on the fact that during the first wave they locked down, which they did. But since then, they've basically been doing nothing. I mean, unlike many other places, they've learned their lesson. And, if you go to Finland right now, you can go get drunk in bars, until midnight if you want, and you can go to restaurants and everything is open, everything is open in Finland. Yeah. And nothing is happening. Absolutely nothing is happening. So, people who say, because people keep making this point, this comparison between Sweden and its neighbors, like I said, for the first wave, we know for a fact they don't provide a good counterfactual. But if you look at what happened after the first wave, well, this comparison is actually a very strong argument in favor of my view, that policy doesn't make a huge difference because, if you look at Finland, everything is open, nothing is happening. Clearly, there are other factors here.
Let's talk about what are those other factors. So what I have, a theory that and I think there's some literature to support this, that the cases are disproportionately spread by a few super spreaders, that there are a few people, it's like crime. A small portion of the population is responsible for a disproportionate share of the crime. And if you have a population that has less dysfunctional behavior, this is my theory, you will end up just with less COVID because it's not linear. It's not like an aggregate of how everyone behaves. It's like how do the worst behaving people in your society behave as far as sort of what you could call disease hygiene, as far as good best practices. And I think we just have a lot more poorly behaved people in the West than they do in East Asia. And that's consistent with a lot of other data like drug use and crime and other things like that. Does that strike you as plausible?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it strikes me as plausible that this could do some of the work. I mean, something has to explain this, and it can be policy, and it has to be. So there has to be other factors. At least it can be policy alone. But you look at Finland. I mean, the Finland is one of the countries where per capita people drink alcohol the most. So I don't know, how when they get like really hammered, I mean, I'm not sure there are not lots of people that do behave responsibly, I don't know, and they have nothing. So, but the explanation doesn't have to be the same in every place. Maybe in Finland it's that they get very little traffic, international travel, and maybe that plays a huge role, in driving the epidemics. I don't know. I don't know, in some East Asian country, I suspect, like Japan, I suspect that part of the explanation is that, so like I said, my main view is that people's voluntary behavior changes in response to changes in epidemic conditions is what's driving most of the dynamics of the epidemic. And one of the explanations I have in mind for countries like Japan, it's kind of an explanation by default, but again, something has to be an explanation, is that the response function of the population in those countries is just very different from like they're much more risk averse, say, for instance, and so they tend to avoid like gathering with their friends a lot more than people in the West do, and so that's how voluntary behavior end up reducing. Voluntary behavior changes in response to the pandemic ends up reducing transmission a lot more in those countries than it does in Europe or the US. I mean, that's I'm thinking, if it's not, I mean, this is plausible and like, and it's not mutually exclusive, your explanation. I mean, it's also the case that, because you're right, that, it does seem that very few people end up, like most people get infected, never go on to infect anyone. And then those who do end up infecting a lot of people. And so it's probably right, it makes sense that the larger your really bad behaved share, like subpopulation is, and the more badly behaved it is, then the worse it's going to be in terms of like how easily the virus is going to be able to spread. And
yeah, the behavioral thing is very plausible to me, because when I moved, I never lived in an area with a lot of East Asians, but then I came out to study at UCLA. And I would walk around campus sometime and I would see people in masks. And I never saw people wear masks in public before. And I would see these people and I'm like, oh, they must have like a disease. They must be like somebody who has really something bad, and they must be something unique about it. But I saw a lot, and it was sometimes around the UCLA Medical Center. So I thought maybe they're just people getting treatment at UCLA Medical Center, and they're otherwise sick people, and this is why they're wearing the mask. But then I noticed I never saw a white person wearing a mask. I never saw a Hispanic person wearing a mask. It was always Asians, right? And it turns out that a lot of people from China and Korea just wore masks in Los Angeles because the pollution is better than it was like 20 years ago, but it's a dry area. So apparently the air is worse than it is in a lot of other places. And it was just completely normal for them to wear masks. So like masks around in the LA area, they sold out pretty early. Because it was just so completely normal for them to wear masks. And I went to a Korean supermarket once, and they gave us gloves. I mean, they gave us gloves at like the beginning of the pandemic. I'd never seen that before in any other store in the U.S. since this pandemic started. And they did a quick temperature check where they shot you with the temperature gun. And I was just taken aback by this. So who knows? I mean, it's hard to measure these things. It's impossible to prove these things, but what you have is the data. I mean, what you just have is this map of the world where East Asia is just completely light, and then Europe and America are dark. And there must be something deep there, and it can't be policy. Exactly what you said, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that clearly there's a lot we don't understand about this thing. And one thing that annoys me with the dominant discourse, that policy explains everything, is that it falsely gives the impression that this is not true, that we do understand very well what's going on, and we clearly don't. I mean, my God, if we could really, if we understand things as well as the pro-lockdown crowd tends to claim, then how come all of the projections, in most countries have been so deeply wrong? Recently, like in France, and maybe I'll write about this, but there is a study that came out that's been used by by epidemiologists who advise the French government. So the main epidemiologist in the scientific council that advises the government, the French government, and that finds that the British variant, is like 59% more transmissible than the wild type, which I don't believe for a second. It's just like it's basically impossible to reconcile that with other data. I mean, they do get this estimate from data. It's basically about how quickly the share of the infections by this variant has increased. And it's true. It's very puzzling. It has been increasing fast everywhere it's been introduced, but then there's something they don't do in their paper, which I did. Like if you look at what their model implies in terms of what the incidence curve would look like right now, And basically right now, if based on their model, there should be over 100,000 cases per day in France. Actually, there is only 20,000. It hasn't been increasing at all. So clearly their model is wrong. I don't know what explains why this variant has been increasing like that, but instead of just assuming, taking at face value their results, they should make allowance for the fact that clearly there's something they're missing here, and they don't understand something, and not pretend that they do. But that's what the pro lockdown people tends to do. They tend by saying it's all about policy. They're kind of like talking as if there wasn't so many things we don't understand about this, but East Asia or even places like Finland, clearly they show that there's a lot we don't understand. We have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and you're right. And this is a longer discussion. I think something we'll be talking about in the future is just the incentive structure of academia. What do they judge you on when you go out for an academic job? They're looking at your CV, and the CV is the number of publications and where they're placed. And everyone is playing the same game. And the people who are reviewing your publications are themselves don't care about your publication. They care about their own publication. They care about if you cite them. That's what they worry about, and that's what the system is selecting for. So they might say during the review you didn't cite Johnson, and Johnson, you can guess usually Johnson is the reviewer, and so they're just passing along, and they're just producing sort of just these. The stacks and stacks of paper, I guess not paper anymore, whatever, computer information data. And they're just playing this game, and they're building the CV, and no one is checking. No one is incentivized to go, and somebody might check something at some point. But the vast majority of it just never gets checked, and it never gets reasoned about. It never gets put in its proper context. It just becomes science. It shows up on Google Scholar. It has, 800 citations after it. It's official. It's gospel at that point. And the whole system is just screwed up. This is not about epidemiology. This is not about medicine. This is the way we produce and spread knowledge. There is just something very off about the incentive structure, and it's something that we've got to fix.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And actually, one of the things I'm very excited about being part of CSPI as a research fellow is that I think that's a place where we can do some really serious post-publication review, basically, where we can look at things in a more serious way than it gets looked at in the pre-publication peer review system, where, as you said, the whole incentive structure is completely messed up. And if you look at this paper that I just told you about, that they just accept, the guy did an interview in Lemoine, which is the most prestigious French newspaper, saying, oh yeah, no, the new variants, like this British variant, is definitely like between 50 and 70% more transmissible. It's been scientifically proven, and blah blah blah. Like I said, you do a simple check on his paper, and you see that it makes no sense with the data we have. There are more data. Recently I calculated the correlation between the share of the variant in each French department and the weekly growth rate of the number of cases in those departments, and it's literally zero. Now, this guy is telling me that this thing is like 60% more transmissible, and it didn't even occur to him that it might be weird, not to find even a little bit of a correlation between the share of that variant. And, it's absurd. I mean, how can you publish this? How can this be taken seriously? So, yeah, I mean, I do anticipate we'll talk a lot more about this in the future, but that this pandemic has also been it has, at least if you have eyes to see, I think it has shed a lot of light on the whole process, on how messed up it is. And there's a lot to be said about this.
Yeah. So I mean that's a great that's a great transition. So moving away from the lockdowns, I mean, I just wanted to take advantage to get you here, because I got you here to talk about the culture wars in France, because you are a proud Frenchman, and you're interested in these this political correctness, these wokeness, these social issues, and people, I mean, when I was, like 10, 15 years ago, liberals used to point to Europe as this sort of liberal utopia, because they cared mostly about, like, they thought about Iraq, and Europe was like, liberal on Iraq, and Europe was also liberal on the things they cared about, which was more economic issues. So they had like, universal health care and stuff. And now there's an idea that basically there's all this far right stuff going on in Europe. And France in particular has been really, I mean, there's like Hungary and Poland, and they're doing something that the media really is, liberals are really angry about, but they're not culturally that important. But France is seen as culturally very important. And Macron has been sort of just having a conversation, a running conversation with the New York Times. And the way the New York Times tells it, now I would caution people against interpreting they're basing their understanding of a country based on what the New York Times says. Often that's all we have. But imagine if you were understanding America through just New York Times articles, it would be very, very distorted. And so there's no reason to think it's better in other countries. But this is what we're getting from the New York Times on France: is that basically Macron has declared a war on political correctness. He's declared war on feminism. Well, not so much feminism, but at least Islamism and sort of white guilt and affirmative action. Well, they don't have affirmative action, but like the ideas behind Black Lives Matter, the tearing down historical statues. He's just drawn a line there, and this is something that is angering, this sort of activist class that's more American influenced. You're in Paris right now. What does it look like from there?
So I think one crucial difference with what is true is that the elites in France are, wokeness, this whole like great awakening, I like this expression a lot, thing has not been, at least so far, I'm not sure it's going to last, but so far it hasn't been as successful in like basically conquering the elites in France as in the US, not nearly as successful. So a lot more people in the media elite, political elite, just don't want to do anything with this stuff in France. Whereas in the US, it's been incredible how fast they have been won over by this. So that includes Macron. Macron is definitely not, he's sincerely not woke, but where people have I think mistaken perception is that they see, so especially on the left, even in France, this is true to some extent, but pardon me, certainly in the US, people have this impression they see as, it's like they think that Macron has basically become some kind of like far right guy who's now on a crusade against Islamism and feminism and wokeness, or whatever you want to call it. And that's widely exaggerated. Basically, Macron is like a typical center-left centrist. He's center-left on some things and center-right on others, but is a typical French centrist. And it's just that typical French centrists find all this wokeness stuff ridiculous. But it's not like, he's not going to do anything serious about it. So like they're talking like the French minister of research of higher education has been like talking about doing some investigation. I can tell you nothing's going to happen. They're going to make some noise because that's Macron's, a lot of what Macron is doing. He makes some noise, because he knows that there's a good, like it pays off electorally speaking. But the truth is that wokeness is making very quick gains in French academia, and this is going to continue because they're heavily influenced by this stuff that's coming from the US. And it is coming from the US. I see people who think they're smart, making fun of like, oh, the French conservatives are scared of this stuff that comes from the US, whereas in the US, they're scared of this French theory and stuff like that. Well, both things are true. If you think you're smart because you think that there's a contradiction here, honestly, you're just not as smart as you think. It's true that a lot of this stuff in the US has been influenced by French intellectuals, and no, it's coming back. Where's the contradiction? There is none. It's terrible, but that people can see these things. But like I said, this wokeness stuff, it's gaining grounds rapidly in French academia. The difference with the US is that it's having a much harder time to go outside academia. They're starting. I think it's gonna work in journalism, but even there, it's not gonna work to the extent it worked in the US, or at least it will take longer. So that's the main difference with the US. I wouldn't say that wokeness has not been extremely successful in academia. It's still like, French academia is still much less woke than the US academia. American academia is going to take longer there too. But if you look at young academics, graduate students, etc., in France, there's definitely less woke people even among them than in the US, among the same like age group and occupation. But still, it's definitely growing. the difference is that in the US, basically, all of a sudden, large swath of journalism, of even corporations, got into this stuff, and this has not happened in France. And I think I wouldn't say that it won't happen eventually, but certainly right now it's nothing like the US. And if it does happen eventually in France, it will take longer. I mean, if academia gets totally taken over by this stuff, I'm pretty sure eventually this will happen in France too. But that's the difference. So Macron is doing this stuff. It's genuine. Again, he doesn't get wokeness. Like, again, he's a traditional French centrist. All this stuff to him is nonsense. I mean, it is nonsense for any person who's not crazy. But he genuinely doesn't get it, and he finds that ridiculous. I do not doubt that he's sincere in this way, but I also do not doubt that he doesn't have the political will to go to war, against wokeness in academia. So he's going to make a bunch of noise. His minister is going to make a bunch of noise. They're going to set up some kind of commission. Maybe they won't even set it up because there was an outcry from in academia. But maybe they will set it up, and this thing will do a report that nobody will read and nobody will care about it. And the wokeification of French academia will continue apace. Because that's what's going to happen. And then everybody's think is on the left, even in France, but especially in the US, is talking about Macron as if, he was going to be a new Orban, or, he was going to completely crush, wokeness in academia and in other places. And, this is just not going to happen. People who think that they just don't understand who Macron is and what he's likely to do is never going to do that.
Yeah, I think an interesting difference between the American and the French situation is you said, well, France, Macron is not going to do anything. In part, he doesn't have to do a lot to be better off than the US because it is so institutionalized in law here. So in France, we talk about the abuse of science. In the US, one of the worst things we have is data gathering on racial differences. And we have racial data on everything. And you find disparities in every single thing. And this is the justification for affirmative action, diversity, and all of that. In France, they don't even keep statistics, right, on these racial differences in like crime. So you can't even figure out like what percentage of France is Black or North African. Like you can people have done unofficial estimates, but you can't do that directly. And so in America, the whole project of racial equality has this sort of scientism around it, in that, we're researchers and we have all this racial data, and now there's so much we can do with it. And the government has levers with which to do about it. It has anti-discrimination law that it applies very widely and then says it's disparate impact, and that has a downstream cultural effect. In France, if you don't have that sort of legal, bureaucratic, so-called scientific structure, there's just a lot less that the culture is not less influenced by it, and there's a lot less that government can do to sort of, like attack standards and like standardized tests. It's harder to do because when they do it here, they'll say, it's because of a racial disparity. In France, they don't even have the data. So, they don't know that there's a difference between Chinese and African French and white Frenchmen. There's just no data at all. And that prevents what you could do. I think it's a good example of like a place where less knowledge is good, because the way the knowledge and the data is used is just abusive, and it's a power grab for the government and power grab for certain cultural people with certain cultural views they want to force on everyone else.
So, I'm in broad agreement with what you say. I do want to nuance it a bit, because unlike what most people think, we do actually have data on this.
Then it's hopeless.
So basically, most people think it's illegal to collect that data on race in France, and that's not quite true. The law allows research for research purposes. It allows research to be done into this. So it's just that it's mostly not done for cultural reasons, although this is changing. So we have very few data, but we do have data. We do have data on this. It's nothing like the US. So this is true. Like the US. And another thing is
census. We know every city, every town, the demographic.
Yeah. And so, for instance, in France, the census doesn't ask about your race, and this is probably not going to change anytime soon. The state, no government institution except against research institutes collect data on this. This is actually illegal. So the state cannot, store data on the citizens, based on race. And so we're never going to have a lot of this stuff, or at least as long as this is true, we're never going to have the sort of things that you have in the US. And I think it's true that it has a huge effect on the legal superstructures. And this has downstream effect on culture, et cetera. And this is definitely true. But we do have data on this, and it's allowed for research purposes, but for cultural reasons, which again, it's everything. All of this is influenced. The culture is affected by the lack of legal structure. That, like you said, it has this legal structure has downstream effect on culture, and then this is a process that feeds itself. In France, it's a lot for research purposes, but for the most part, people don't do it. They don't collect data on this because there is this taboo about race in France, and so, which I'm of two minds on this. Like, I mean, I agree with you that it has definitely some fortunate consequences, and in general, I really don't like this model of a society that's divided in different communities, and with very strong like cultural barriers between them, and you kind of like, politics is about arbitrating between those different competing interests. I mean, I know to some extent it's true in every society, but I think that when race gets into the picture, you easily end up with like some kind of caste society, and that's not a model of society I really like. So,
can I tell you an example in the U.S.? What we don't collect is religious data, and there was a big thing about Islamophobia like 10, 15 years ago, and I think Islamophobia is more of a real thing in America than a lot of the other things that people woke talk about. But there is very little government initiative on Islamophobia, just because we don't have data on how many Muslims there are, whether Muslims are being disproportionately stopped by the police or they're being disproportionately whatever. We just don't collect the data. So it's just a nice example within the United States about how not having the data just helps you out. I think that you would find all kinds of interesting religious differences in the U.S. if we collected that data. We just do not.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, again, there is no doubt that things would be very different in France if the state started collecting all this data, and like all those disparities would show. But like we do have basically those data exist. I mean, not nearly as much as in the US, but there are academic papers that you can read where I have some of those data on my computer. Like you have.
Yeah. I guess the sense is having authoritative coming from the government is different, because everyone can just. I mean, I think you can sort of gaslight. You can if you're on the other side, you could always say, well, that person is just full of it. That person didn't measure. It creates some uncertainty. Less so in the United States, but yeah. Let me ask you this. So the
let me just add something here. Like, another thing is that to go in like to push the same idea that you were pushing, is that like a very big difference. Again, we have those data. But in France, so it's legal for research institution to collect it, but the government can't act on this data. So that's a crucial difference. Like the French government is never going to have to. When I say it can't act on this data, it's never. If there is a research paper that finds that there's a disparity in school, which we do have such papers between, say, the descendants of North African immigrants and other French people. Sure, people can say that's because of racism, but there's not going to be any affirmative action, because for there to be affirmative action, it would have to be the case that the government be allowed to collect data on this and use it to favor some applicants to some state schools over others. And this can't happen because this is illegal. Collecting data for research purposes, that's not illegal, but this is. So that's definitely true, that I think this is a source of many differences in that regard between France and the US.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think for people in the US, they might want to think about the legal changes and the legal sort of avenues you could take, and the law and the policy that you could pull on to help deal with these issues and make us maybe a little more like France. Let me ask you this. Do you think that Macron, I mean, one thing that I like about Macron's commentary is that when you portray the resistance to wokeness as a foreign invasion, I think that helps with the resistance, because otherwise it's portrayed as what? It's women and people of color are being oppressed, and they're just, they're from the bottom and they just want a chance, and patriarchal racist French society won't give it to them. When if you portray it as, we're France and we're being colonized by the Americans on the other side of the world, it makes it seem like, and which I think this is the true model of the world, it's a source of imperial power, and people will resist imperialism and foreign domination. Do you think that that's like, that's sort of a positive framing? Does that help fight it within France?
Oh, it definitely helps. I mean, anti-Americanism is very strong in France. It's still strong today, even though we are totally colonized. I mean, this model that's what you're saying. I mean, it's true. That's this thing is coming from the U.S. It is American influence, and it is part of the. It's like basically soft power, like imperialism from like a decadent empire. So that's why I like to see it. But it is that's what it is. And anti-Americanism is very strong in France. So if something gets portrayed in the media as coming from the US, being like some American influence and like opposed to some traditional values that we have in France, oh yeah, you can bet that this will help. So I do think this framing is politically useful to fight this stuff. And, it just happens to be the case that in addition is true. So that's even better.
Yeah, and maybe having sort of the U.S. become more openly woke, where if you say wokeness came from the U.S., but Trump is president, it's still true that wokeness is coming from the U.S., but it sort of looks like that Trump is like, obviously completely different. And so, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of, we'll have, it'll be interesting to see, how this plays out. I mean, I'm amazed. I mean, there was a story about Japan. Japan is always, held up as sort of this place that resists, the sort of Western cultural influences. Its own unique thing. And they had a guy who was on the Olympic Committee, and he said something like, "Women talk too much during the meetings." And he apologized, and the New York Times was like, how could this be a country where he just apologizes and they move on, and then he gets fired, and then the New York Times takes a victory lap, and you're like, wow, Japan has fallen, and you wonder what's gonna sort of maintain itself. I think that you sometimes when you have political difference, I see in Russia and Eastern Europe, they sort of define themselves as anti this wokeness and political correctness. So maybe that helps. China defines itself in opposition to the West. I see places like Sweden and like Germany. I just see them completely swallowing this stuff with absolutely zero resistance or pushback. And France, it seems like it's somewhere in between, where they talk about it. There's some resistance to it, but it's also making inroads.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if the population, mainstream politicians are definitely opposed to it, but it doesn't mean that they're going to do what would need to be done to really fight it, and they won't. I mean, what's going to happen next? In 2022 next year we have another presidential election. I think the most likely outcome right now is Macron's going to win. I think he's going to win probably like 55-45, but I have to say that this is also what I was saying a few years ago after he was elected. But now, after the yellow vest, after the pandemic and everything, I'm thinking, that there is a lot more variance in that prediction than used to be the case. So, I still think it's overwhelmingly likely that he will win. But you never know, so some weird things could happen. I mean, Macron himself was a weird thing, like it wasn't supposed to happen. It did. So who knows? After that, I mean, there's something interesting. Like we never had anything like Fox News in France. Like the media was always. It wasn't, and it still isn't. Although this won't last long in the media, I think it's one of those things that are going to be taken over. It wasn't like woke or anything, but it was like classical French left kind of bias. And it's for the most part, it's still the case. But I do think that in the media, journalists are going to get taken over by this stuff. Like young journalists are really into this woke stuff, and I think it's only going to get worse from now.
Yeah. Is there data showing? They keep saying young academics, young journalists in France. I don't doubt that it could be true. Do we have data on that?
I don't think we have good data on this. No, I don't think we do. But I have. It is. Granted, it is purely anecdotal evidence, but I do know a lot of them in both categories. So I'm pretty confident that it is increasing very fast in those categories. But the difference with the US is that it's having a lot of difficulties making inroads outside of those things.
Yeah. Wasn't there data that Le Pen and Front National didn't they have a lot of young support?
Yes, so that's the difference between France and, say, the UK. Yeah, the Le Pen, I'm not sure that's still the case, but for quite some time was the first, like the Rassemblement National, the party, um, was the first party among people between 18 and 24. And this was true for several years. I don't know if it's still true, but yeah, you have that's surprising, and it's not something you see again not something you see in the US. In the US, it's difficult to compare because you have very strong bipartisan. Well, you only have two main parties, and the rest basically doesn't exist. This is also kind of true in the UK, but it's a bit less true.
Yeah.
And in the UK, there's also like very little support for the right or the far right among young people. So this is strange. But Mélenchon, the far left guy, also has a lot of support among young people. And I think so. I don't take my word on this because I'd have to check. But I seem to remember that in more recent polls, Mélenchon was no first, and it wasn't Le Pen anymore among young people. But paradoxically, that's a huge difference between France and between Trump and Le Pen. For instance, that Trump's strength was mainly among old people, and what put Biden over, I guess, probably the main thing is that he made enough inroads among old people that was enough to beat Trump, basically. And in France, Le Pen's problem is actually old people. The reason why Le Pen hasn't won a presidential election, that's because of old people, because old people don't vote for the National Front or the Rassemblement.
Well, I think Le Pen lost every age group, but lost old people the worst. And so
yeah. No, she wouldn't die. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, I misspoke.
Head to head, yeah.
She wasn't going to win last time, even if she had like old people. But she lost by the widest margin among old people, which is very surprising from I bet for an American. That's not what you would expect based on what you see in the US. Maybe if she'd had a margin as strong as, no, she wouldn't have won last time. But this time, I don't think she's going to win again. But if she had the kind of margin among old people that Trump does, then she would definitely win this time. But she won't, because she doesn't, and she won't.
Yeah. I was looking at the Polish data, and there was two mainstream candidates, and the young people went more for the mainstream liberal candidate, but there was also a huge jump among the young for the real hardcore, more nationalist candidate too. So it was like almost nothing in the old people, and the young people was like 20% or something. So you do see that where I think in continental Europe, it's not like the Anglosphere. At least I think the US and UK, where it's universally the young are more liberal, and part of that is because of race, and because the young people are more non-white, but also just within whites, you see greater liberalism at the younger ages. And it seems like it's a little more complicated in Europe. Maybe that's the general trend, but there's more difference. I mean, but I would be interested in like young college graduates more than I would be just young people in general in France, because that's going to determine the future. If Le Pen or these nationalists are the party of less educated young people, maybe they'll be electorally viable in the future, but they're not going to affect the culture all that much.
Yeah, and they are. I mean, like there is a huge education gradient that we see basically everywhere in the West. There's this polarization along educational lines that we've seen in the US, that we've seen in the UK, that we see in France too. Like, it's really striking. It's a widespread phenomenon so there are some differences, like the age like as it affects the how people vote differently in France, very differently in France than in the US. And it's definitely not just because of the race plays out differently, like at different age, because that's also true in France, probably to a similar extent to the US. But even if you just look at white people, young white people and old white people, it's a huge difference. Like in France, the old white people, they're going to vote more right wing, but they're not going to vote for Le Pen. And but the education thing, the polarization along educational lines, this is something that you see in France very strongly, just like as you see it in the US and as you see it in the UK. In the US, it seems to be one of the main reasons that Trump has made gains among non-whites, at the last election, is because mostly it's been making those gains among uneducated, non-college educated, non-whites. And so, that's how strong this education effect is. And you see that in France too. It's kind of this phenomenon I find pretty fascinating. You really have this, it's really striking how uniform it is across the West. And probably beyond the West. I'm pretty sure in Japan you could probably see that too. I don't know enough about politics in Japan, but I would be surprised if you could see.
I had someone try to explain to me the politics in Korea once, and it didn't sound like anything like the West actually. So I don't know how. So they were saying that the right wing party in Korea at some point wanted to put halal meals into schools or something because they had like 2 Muslims in Korea, I guess, or something. And this was the right wing party, and the left wing party was sort of opposed to that. And someone said that to me, and I was like, what? That's completely different. So I don't know how much this stuff translates. I think especially right left. I think Korea is more westernized. Japan, or especially something like China. I don't know if you'd see these. You'd see anything similar in these kind of divisions. Even Eastern Europe. I saw Putin's approval rating with Russia, with Russian young people, was pretty high, and I don't think there was this huge drop off. It might have changed in the last few years. Last time I checked was last time when I read this, it was like 3 or 4 years ago. But he was doing very well with the young people in Russia. So yeah, I don't know if that's actually held over time. But anyways, this has been, a fascinating conversation, Philippe. We covered a lot of ground. I'm excited to bring you on to CSPI. I love the lockdown piece. You got it into the Wall Street Journal. It's part of the conversation, and I look forward to doing a lot more with you and seeing what you produce.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and I'm also looking forward to it. I think there's a lot of great things we can do, and I'm very excited. There are already a lot of good people at CSPI, and I'm very excited about contributing to it and making it something that matters. Putting it on the intellectual map and making a contribution. That's going to be great.
All right, great, man. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.